"You belong to me tonight," said the Godfather. Nia moved cautiously down the hall, the weight of every step amplifying in the silence of the luxurious mansion. Her rag in hand, she was about to begin her morning routine when she heard a low sound, a rustle, followed by the sharp crack of a phone hitting the marble floor. The noise wasn't what stopped her. It was the quiet, controlled sigh that followed it, the kind that suggested frustration, or perhaps something deeper. Her heart skipped a beat. Ernesto wasn't supposed to be awake at this hour, but here he was, standing in the middle of the grand living room, a single lamp casting shadows that made his silhouette even more imposing. The large man, sharp in his tailored gray suit, stood tall with a calmness that felt unnervingly powerful. His tattoos, dark and intricate, creeping just above his collar, hinted at a life far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. As she hesitated, caught between turning back up the staircase or stepping forward, he turned slowly, his piercing eyes locking with hers. The moment was suffocating, and for the first time since she'd started, Nia felt like she wasn't invisible in his world. "You're up early." His voice, low and commanding, broke the silence. It wasn't a greeting, it wasn't an accusation, it was merely a statement, like he already knew her every move. Nia forced a nervous smile, moving down the last few steps. "Good morning, sir. I was just going to clean." His gaze moved down her body slowly, lingering on the rag in her hands, then her apron. The tension between them crackled, thick and heavy. "You're new," he said, his voice still smooth, but with an edge of something more. His words didn't just linger in the air, they seemed to press against her, heavy and deliberate. "Yes," Nia replied softly, trying to keep her composure, but his presence was too much. Ernesto's lips twisted into a knowing smirk as he stepped closer, his pace deliberate, each movement echoing like a warning. It was a walk that was both predatory and oddly sensual, making Nia's pulse race against her will. His eyes never left her face, as though he was memorizing every detail, evaluating her. "You don't have to impress anyone," he remarked, his voice a smooth drawl, but the way he said it, the way his eyes held hers, spoke volumes. Nia's breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to be afraid of him, but the magnetism in his gaze, the quiet power he exuded, made it impossible not to feel a shift in the air between them. A tension that had been there all along, but was now too thick to ignore. Nia hesitated at the top of the grand staircase, the weight of her cleaning rag in hand feeling heavier than it should have. The mansion, with its marble floors and polished furniture, felt colder today, more imposing. She was about to begin her routine when a noise caught her off guard, a soft clatter followed by a muttered curse, a voice low and controlled. Her heart skipped a beat. Ernesto Marco. She had heard his name whispered among the staff, a shadow cast over every room he entered. She was certain he was rarely home at this hour. Yet there he was. Nia stood frozen at the top of the stairs, her breath shallow as she watched him below. Ernesto was the kind of man who commanded attention with nothing more than his presence. His sharp jawline, graying hair, and tailored suit made him look like something out of a dream. Dark, dangerous, and utterly untouchable. But it wasn't just the way he looked that unsettled her. It was the feeling that followed him into every room, the feeling that he knew everything, saw everything. She had seen him from a distance before, but never like this. He stood near the center of the living room, back slightly turned, his hands braced on the edge of a glass table. A spilled pen lay on the floor, its ink smudged on the marble, and a folder of papers hung half open in his hand. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, exposing his forearms, where dark tattoos curled like whispers of a past she couldn't even begin to understand. Each design seemed purposeful, calculated, an extension of the power he held so effortlessly. It was the kind of ink that told stories, and every story was one Nia knew better than to get involved in. But it was the way he moved, quiet and deliberate, that caught her off guard. For someone so imposing, he glided through the space like a predator. She watched as he slowly lifted his head, his gaze locking onto hers with a precision that made her blood freeze. "You're up early," he said, his voice smooth, low, and unexpectedly commanding. It wasn't a question, more like an observation, one that made her feel as if he had already sized her up without even needing to speak. Nea's heart raced, her instincts telling her to retreat, to turn back, but her legs betrayed her. She took a small step down, the sound of her shoes clicking too loudly in the stillness. "Good morning, sir," she managed, though her voice barely held steady. "I was just coming to clean." He didn't respond immediately, but his eyes didn't leave hers. His attention was unnervingly sharp, scanning her like he was seeing straight through her, looking for something she hadn't even realized she was hiding. The tension in the air grew thick, wrapping around them both, pressing in on her chest until it felt like the walls were closing in. She had worked around plenty of intimidating people before, but none had made her feel so... "You're new," he observed, his gaze flicking to the name tag on her uniform. "Yes," she whispered, her heart thundering in her ears. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just watched her, as if deciding what to make of her, or perhaps deciding how far he would let this go. Nia felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch, and in that moment, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. Ernesto finally straightened, closing the folder with a soft snap. He took a step toward her, and for the first time since she entered the room, Nia realized how much space he took up. He filled it with ease, the very air seeming to bend to his will. His presence was a force, a quiet storm that stirred something deep inside her, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. "Don't worry," he said, his voice a touch softer now, but the edge was still there, unmistakable. "You don't have to impress anyone." His eyes lingered on her, an unspoken challenge passing between them. Nia's breath hitched. She didn't want to be afraid of him. She couldn't afford to be. But she was, and she couldn't deny that something else, something darker, was pulling her closer to him than she'd ever planned. Nia's hands trembled as she carefully dusted the shelves in the mansion's library. It had been a week since her first encounter with Ernesto, and every day since, he lingered in her thoughts, uninvited. His presence, the way he observed her, the depth of his gaze. It haunted her when she woke, and it lingered in her dreams at night. She tried to push him out of her mind, focusing on her tasks, but no matter how hard she tried, his dark eyes seemed to follow her, even in the quiet spaces of her mind. It was the sound of footsteps approaching that broke her from her thoughts. Nia didn't need to look up to know who it was. The staff moved in and out of the mansion with a certain rhythm, and it was Hannah, the senior housekeeper, who appeared at the door of the library with a knowing look in her eyes. Nia offered a polite smile, but the older woman didn't return it. Instead, she closed the door behind her, locking it with a soft click that made Nia's pulse quicken. "You've been here long enough," Hannah began, her voice low, cautious. "You must have noticed how things work around here." Her eyes darted toward the corner where a few of the security cameras were discreetly hidden in the rafters. Nia frowned, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "I try to stay out of the way," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "I just do my job." Hannah's gaze sharpened, and she took a few steps closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not that simple, Nia. Not here. Not with him." "Him?" Nia asked, her heart skipping a beat. She knew exactly who Hannah meant, but she couldn't bring herself to speak his name out loud. "The boss," Hannah continued, glancing around to make sure no one could overhear. "Ernesto Marco isn't just a man, Nia. He's a force." Her eyes locked with Nia's, full of something that was half pity, half warning. "You don't want to catch his attention. He notices things people don't realize are being noticed." Nia's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" Hannah stepped even closer, her voice so quiet now that Nia could barely hear her. "People who catch his eye don't last long. Either they're too afraid to stay, or they get too close and end up buried in some mess. He doesn't play nice, not with anyone. You're new, so you don't know. But I've seen it before. He's dangerous. Be careful." Nia swallowed hard, her throat tightening as the weight of Hannah's words sank in. She wasn't sure what to make of the warning. Was it just a story, a rumor, a cautionary tale passed down to keep the staff in line? Or was there truth to it? She forced herself to speak. "I'm just here to work, Hannah. I'm not looking for trouble." Hannah studied her for a moment, as if trying to gauge whether Nia truly understood what was being said. Finally, she nodded, but her expression remained heavy, like a burden she couldn't shake off. "You'll figure it out soon enough. Just remember, Nia, stay out of his way. Don't give him a reason to notice you. It's easier that way." As Hannah turned and left the library, Nia stood frozen in place, the silence of the room swallowing her. But the truth of the warning hung in the air like a cloud, thick and suffocating. The more Nia thought about it, the more she realized just how much Ernesto had noticed her already. The way he looked at her, the way his presence lingered, unsettling yet intoxicating, it was more than just passing interest. She couldn't deny it anymore. Despite Hannah's words, despite the danger, Nia found herself thinking about Ernesto more than she should. He was always in the back of her mind. His dark eyes, his tattoos, and that quiet, dangerous power he carried. Even now, as she tried to focus on her work, it was his face that she saw behind her eyelids, his voice that echoed in her thoughts. And deep down, she knew she was already in too deep to pull away. Nia felt it long before she saw him. It was the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way the air seemed to grow heavier whenever Ernesto entered the room. His presence was always felt before it was seen, like a shadow that filled every corner, no matter how far he was. She tried to ignore it, to stay focused on her work, but it was becoming harder with each passing day. The mansion had its rhythm, and Nia had settled into her tasks, keeping her head down and doing what was expected of her. She had gotten used to the sound of the guards moving in and out, the quiet hum of the house at night, and the soft clink of her cleaning supplies. But nothing in the mansion could prepare her for the weight of Ernesto's gaze, a presence so intense that it felt as though he was watching her from every room, even when he wasn't physically there. She could feel it when she was dusting the grand staircase, his eyes on her back, a pull she couldn't explain. Every now and then she would glance up, only to meet his piercing stare from across the room. His eyes never wavered, always studying, always calculating. They weren't the kind of eyes that simply looked at someone. They stripped away everything, leaving only what mattered. And what mattered, Nia began to realize, was her. His attention was becoming more and more obvious. It wasn't just the lingering glances, the way he stood a little too close when he spoke to her, or the way his voice seemed to lower in pitch whenever he addressed her. It was everything. The way he moved, always so deliberate, like he knew exactly how to command the space around him. The way he watched her as though he could see right through her professional facade, peeling back every layer until there was nothing left but the woman underneath. Today, as she was dusting the library shelves, she could feel his eyes on her from the doorway. She tried to focus, pretending she didn't notice, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Her movements became stilted, her hands a little too shaky as she adjusted the frame of an ornate mirror. She couldn't help herself. She stole a glance over her shoulder, and there he was, standing just inside the room, arms crossed, his dark eyes locked onto hers. The moment their gazes met, everything in the room seemed to still. His stare was intense, almost too intense, as if he was reading her every thought, every feeling. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just watched her, as though waiting for something, but for what, Nia couldn't tell. Her heart raced, her breath caught in her throat. She forced herself to turn back to the task at hand, wiping away dust, but her movements were slower now, more deliberate. She could feel his eyes on her every move, watching, studying, waiting for her to break. "Is everything all right?" His voice broke through the silence, smooth and deliberate, like a low rumble in the distance. He wasn't asking because he cared. He was asking because he knew she was trying to avoid him, trying to pretend she hadn't noticed the way he watched her. "Yes, sir," she replied quickly, her voice a little too tight. "Just trying to finish up here." He took a step closer, and she stiffened, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. His presence was overwhelming. He was close enough now that she could smell his cologne, a rich, earthy scent that made her pulse race. "You don't have to rush," he said, his voice just above a whisper, each word deliberate. "There's no need to act like I'm not here." Nia's breath hitched. She felt trapped, caught between the need to be professional and the undeniable pull of his presence. She wanted to step away, put some distance between them, but something inside her refused to move. It wasn't fear, it was something else, something deeper, a temptation she couldn't quite resist. She forced herself to focus on the shelf, trying to ignore the way his gaze felt like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. But as she moved to adjust a vase, her fingers brushed against his. The contact was brief, barely enough to register, but it was enough to send a jolt of electricity through her body. Ernesto didn't pull away. Instead, his hand lingered just for a second before he stepped back with a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Careful," he said softly. "You wouldn't want to break anything, would you?" The playful tone in his voice only added to the tension, and Nia forced a smile, though it felt brittle, unnatural. "I'll be more careful, sir." But inside, she was anything but careful. Inside, the pull between them was becoming impossible to ignore. Nia felt the weight of his eyes on her the moment she stepped into the living room. She could almost feel them before she saw him, dark, unreadable, fixed on her with an intensity that made every muscle in her body tighten. Ernesto stood near the grand piano, his posture relaxed but commanding, his presence filling the room like a storm on the horizon. She had become so accustomed to his quiet dominance, but today it felt different. His gaze seemed sharper, more calculating, as if he were waiting for something. She forced herself to move with the same practiced efficiency she always had, but it was harder today. The air was thick with tension, and it wasn't just because of his proximity. There was a subtle shift in the way he moved, slightly closer than usual, a step that brought him within arm's reach. Nia could feel the heat of his gaze like a physical touch, her skin prickling under his scrutiny. "How are you today, Nia?" Ernesto's voice was casual, but there was an underlying edge to it, something that made her pulse stutter. "Fine, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady, though the words felt thin and fragile. She didn't want to show weakness, but everything about this moment felt charged, as if the room itself was holding its breath. He didn't answer immediately, but the way he studied her, as if seeing through her every movement, made it impossible for Nia to focus. She wiped down the counter in the kitchen, pretending to be absorbed in the task, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her every move. He stepped closer, just enough to close the distance between them, and Nia's breath caught in her throat. "I thought you'd be finished by now," he said, his voice low, tinged with a playful edge. "You're moving so slowly today. Something on your mind?" Nia's heart skipped. She knew this wasn't an innocent question. It was a challenge, a test. She couldn't tell if he was simply toying with her or if there was something more behind it. Either way, it was uncomfortable. His attention was far too intense, far too personal for someone in his position. I'm sorry, sir. I'll finish it quickly," she said, keeping her voice as even as she could, though her hands were shaking slightly as she continued to clean the counters. "Don't rush," he murmured, his voice sending a shiver down her spine. "I want to watch you work." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Nia's stomach twisted, but she kept her eyes fixed on the surface in front of her. She couldn't look up at him. If she did, she might break, might reveal just how badly her heart was racing, how the attraction she had tried so hard to keep buried was pushing its way to the surface. "Ernesto, She started to speak but stopped herself, afraid to show weakness. He was standing right next to her now, close enough that Nia could feel the heat radiating off him. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her chest, but his was calm, steady, like he had all the time in the world to play this game. Without warning, he reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm in a touch so light it almost felt like a ghost. But the sensation sent a jolt through her, a wave of heat spreading from where his skin made contact. "You're still tense," he said, his voice low and almost soothing, but Nia could hear the amusement in it. "Relax, Nia. You're not a servant. You don't have to be afraid of me." She looked up at him, her breath catching as their gazes locked. The words were meant to reassure, but they only made the situation more confusing. How was she supposed to feel? She had been warned about him, about how dangerous he could be, how much power he held, but all of that was mixed with the undeniable pull she felt every time he was near. "I'm not afraid," she said, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying her. Ernesto smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips that made her pulse quicken. "We'll see," he said quietly, his eyes darkening with something she couldn't name. Nia stood there, frozen between fear and something else entirely, caught in the web of his gaze, unsure of how to move, unsure of what to do next. Nia tried to shake off the feeling that had taken root inside her, but it was impossible. The mansion, once just a cold place of work, now seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't ignore. Every hallway, every room, seemed to hum with the tension that lingered between her and Ernesto. The distance between them grew shorter with each passing day, and each time their eyes met, she could feel him drawing her in. It wasn't just the way he looked at her, although that was enough to make her heart race, to make her wonder if he could hear her thoughts. It was the way he spoke to her, the way he seemed to make everything personal, even when he was just making casual remarks. Nia knew he wasn't interested in small talk. He was studying her, testing her, and worse, she felt herself responding to it. She couldn't explain why she was so affected. She'd met powerful men before, but Ernesto was different. He wasn't just powerful, he was dangerous. And yet, she found herself drawn to that danger, like a moth to a flame. Every word he spoke seemed to curl around her, a dark invitation to something she knew she should avoid. She could feel the pull of it, the magnetic force that kept her tethered to him, even when she tried to keep her distance. The morning he asked her to bring him coffee in his office, she hesitated. The mansion was quiet, the halls eerily still, and Nia was sure she was imagining the anticipation that stirred in her stomach. She had been warned, had been told to avoid drawing attention to herself, to keep her distance from him, but even as she knocked on the door, a sense of inevitability washed over her. "Come in." His voice was smooth, low and commanding, just as it always was. Nia stepped into the room, holding the coffee tray with both hands. She kept her eyes down, refusing to let herself linger on the sight of him, sitting behind his desk, looking every bit the dangerous Godfather the world whispered about. "Place it on the desk," he said, his gaze not leaving the papers in front of him, but she could feel his eyes on her, even as she set the tray down. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her every move. "Thank you, Nia," he said, his voice quieter now, almost intimate. The shift in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. "You've been working hard lately. I've noticed." She didn't know what to say. He noticed everything. There was no escaping it, no hiding from him. And suddenly, the air in the room felt thick with something she couldn't identify. Something that was both thrilling and terrifying. "Do you like working here?" Ernesto asked, his voice drifting through the tension that had settled between them. "Do you like being so close to everything?" Nia swallowed, her heart racing. I do," she said, forcing the words out, though her pulse quickened under his gaze. "Good," he murmured, "because the closer you get, the more you'll realize there's nowhere else to go." The weight of his words hit her like a punch. There was a finality to them, a warning wrapped in the words. The door, metaphorically speaking, was closing. She was trapped by her feelings, by his control. Nia turned to leave, her hand gripping the door handle with trembling fingers. "I'll be going now," she said, but her voice was shaky, betraying the conflict inside her. But before she could fully close the door, Ernesto's voice stopped her. "Don't run from me, Nia," he said softly, just loud enough for her to hear. "You'll only regret it later." She didn't turn around. She couldn't. She wasn't sure if it was the fear or the need to escape that made her leave so quickly. But in her heart, she knew this wasn't just a game anymore. The stakes had changed, and she was already in too deep to get out. The air between Nia and Ernesto had been thickening for days, each encounter more charged than the last. She could feel it every time she entered a room he occupied, the weight of his presence pressing on her, pulling her closer. It wasn't just his gaze anymore. There was a tangible electric charge that sparked between them, a tension that simmered just beneath the surface of their interactions. It happened on a quiet evening, just after dusk. The mansion had settled into its usual stillness, the staff gone for the night, and Nia was in the kitchen, cleaning up after the dinner service. Her mind was elsewhere, her hands moving on autopilot, trying to push away the constant thoughts of Ernesto that clung to her like a second skin. She was almost finished when she heard footsteps. Heavy, purposeful steps. She knew who it was before she even turned around. Ernesto stood in the doorway, his figure framed by the dim light of the hallway. He was dressed as he always was. Dark suit, sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the intricate tattoos that trailed up his forearms. The same tattoos that had haunted her thoughts since she first saw them. The same tattoos that told a story she had no right to understand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Nia was frozen, her breath catching in her throat as she took in his presence. His eyes locked onto hers, and she could feel him closing in, step by step, the space between them narrowing until it felt like the whole world had shrunk to just the two of them. "Still working late?" His voice was quiet, but the question held more weight than it should have. Yes," she stammered, struggling to maintain her composure. She forced herself to look away, focusing on the rag in her hand. "I'm almost done, sir." He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching her, as if waiting for her to say more. The silence stretched, and Nia could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel him watching her, not just physically, but deeply, like he was trying to unravel every layer she had carefully constructed to protect herself. "Do you always keep to yourself like this?" Ernesto's voice was low, almost teasing, but there was an edge to it that made her stomach tighten. "It's not healthy, Nia, to keep everything locked up." She didn't know how to respond. His words hung in the air, and she felt exposed, stripped of the armor she had built around herself. He took another step forward, and Nia's breath hitched. The space between them was now so small, she could feel the heat of his body, feel the dangerous proximity of a man who had far more control over her than she was willing to admit. I'm just doing my job," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She hated how weak it sounded, how small she felt in front of him. "You do your job well," he said, his voice softer now, but still filled with an unmistakable command. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the back of her hand, in a touch so light it almost didn't register. But it was enough to send a jolt of heat coursing through her veins. Enough to make her feel like she might break. She froze. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and for the first time, she saw something in them that she couldn't ignore. Something that felt too personal, too intimate. He was close enough now that she could feel the weight of his gaze on her skin, his breath faint against her face. Before either of them could move, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. A knock on the kitchen door broke the spell, and Nia pulled back, startled. Ernesto didn't immediately step away, but his posture shifted, his focus snapping away from her. The moment, the tension, was interrupted by the intrusion of reality. Nia didn't wait for another word. She backed away quickly, her heart still pounding in her chest as she turned to leave the kitchen. She didn't know if it was fear or relief that flooded her, but it didn't matter. The line between them had been crossed, even if they hadn't acted on it. She could feel it in the air, in the space between them. She was no longer safe in the distance she had kept. And now, the question was, would she ever be able to go back? Nia had always known there was something more to Ernesto than the polished exterior he presented to the world. The rumors about his business dealings had always been whispered in hushed tones, the details never fully clear, but it was hard to ignore the way people looked at him, both with respect and fear. She had kept her distance, unwilling to engage with the world he inhabited, thinking that by simply doing her job, she could remain untouched by the darkness that surely lurked in the corners of the mansion. But as the days wore on, she couldn't help but feel herself slipping closer to the edge. Every glance he gave her, every word he spoke, only made the pull stronger. He was dangerous, she knew that. There was a coldness to him, a quiet menace that seemed to emanate from him even when he wasn't speaking. Yet, with each passing day, she found herself drawn to him, the attraction growing with a strength she couldn't fight. That night, it all came crashing down. Nia was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, when the sound of hushed voices reached her ears. She paused, straining to listen, her curiosity piqued. The voices were low, barely audible, but one name floated through the air, unmistakable. Ernesto. She moved closer to the doorway, careful not to make a sound, and peered into the hallway where she saw two men speaking in quiet, urgent tones. One of them was a familiar face, Victor, one of Ernesto's bodyguards. The other man she didn't recognize. "You really think he'll take care of it?" the second man asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Victor's response was a low growl. "Of course he will. This is Marco we're talking about. Nobody crosses him. Nobody." The words hit Nia like a punch to the gut. Marco. Ernesto Marco. She had heard the name before, always in passing, never with any detail, but now, hearing it like this, with such intensity, a horrible realization began to settle in her bones. Ernesto wasn't just some wealthy businessman or a simple private investor, as he had told her. He was part of something much darker. "He's not someone to play games with," Victor continued, his tone hardened with fear. "If we don't handle this right, it's not just our heads on the line, it's everyone's." Nia's breath hitched in her chest. The man she had been so drawn to, the man whose attention made her heart race, was no mere business tycoon. He was someone who controlled power in ways she couldn't even begin to understand. Someone whose reach extended far beyond the walls of the mansion she cleaned. The Mafia. That was the truth she had been blind to. Nia stepped back, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her thoughts were spinning. All the little things, the way Ernesto had always been so calculating, the way people spoke about him with an edge of fear, suddenly clicked into place. She wasn't just dealing with a dangerous man. She was dealing with someone who could destroy lives without a second thought. Her emotions were a tangled mess. Fear gnawed at her insides, but so did something else, something she couldn't quite place. She was terrified of what she had learned, but at the same time, she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. He was dangerous, yes, but there was something intoxicating about the power he held. Something that made her want to stay, to keep walking that thin line between caution and desire. She didn't know what to do with this new knowledge. The truth of who Ernesto was left her feeling small, insignificant in a world that was too big and too dangerous for someone like her. But what terrified her most was the realization that even knowing this, she couldn't seem to pull away from him. The line between fear and fascination was no longer clear. She was in too deep, and somehow she knew she wouldn't be able to escape it, not without consequences, and maybe, deep down, she didn't want to. Nia couldn't remember how long she'd been standing in front of the mansion, the night air cool against her skin, but the weight of the day had left her exhausted. She had spent hours cleaning, her mind wandering with every movement, every time she thought she was safe. Every time she convinced herself that she was in control of her emotions, Ernesto would be there, watching her, his presence thickening the air. The connection between them was undeniable, and it was only growing stronger. Tonight, though, things felt different. The house seemed quieter, but it was as if everything was building towards something she couldn't avoid any longer. The tension between her and Ernesto had been simmering, but it was about to boil over. She knew it, even if she didn't want to admit it. It started when she was walking down the hallway, a simple task, delivering a stack of clean linens to one of the guest rooms. But as she rounded the corner, she came face to face with him. He was standing there, his back to the wall, one hand in his pocket, the other draped casually across his shoulder. His expression was unreadable, but the moment she laid eyes on him, the air shifted. The pull she'd been trying to resist, the attraction that had been so persistent, suddenly felt suffocating. "Nia," he said, his voice low, like a promise. The way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine, one she didn't want to feel, but couldn't stop. "Ernesto," she replied, her voice betraying a mixture of fear and anticipation. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending that nothing was happening between them. He didn't move as she stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers, piercing, knowing. "We need to talk," he said, his tone commanding yet somehow softer than usual. "You can't keep avoiding this." Avoiding what? She wanted to ask, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't deny it any longer. She wasn't just avoiding him. She was avoiding what he represented, the danger, the power, the darkness that seemed to swirl around him. She was avoiding the fact that every time they were close, she felt herself drawn further into a world she didn't belong in. "I'm not avoiding anything," she said, though even she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. Ernesto stepped forward, his body blocking her path, his proximity making her heart race. "Then why are you so afraid of me, Nia?" His words were almost a challenge. His gaze softened for a moment, just enough to unsettle her further. "You think I can't see it?" Her breath caught in her throat. He knew everything, and now she was trapped. "I'm not afraid of you," she lied, but it was so transparent, so flimsy, that even she could tell it wasn't true. Ernesto's smile was faint, almost sad. "I think you are, but that's not the problem, is it?" He moved even closer, and she could feel the heat radiating off his body. "You're afraid of what you might feel if you let yourself go, Nia. Afraid of how much you want this." Nia's mind was spinning, but her body refused to move. She was standing in front of a man who could destroy everything in her life with a single look, but she didn't want to pull away. She didn't want to run. She wasn't sure anymore if she could. He tilted his head, his eyes darkening. "You don't know what you're getting into, do you?" His voice dropped lower, a dangerous edge creeping in. "But that's the beauty of it. You'll never know until it's too late." And in that moment, Nia realized that the line between fear and desire had disappeared. There was no going back. She had already crossed it, and now it was just a matter of how far she was willing to go. The tension between them wasn't just physical anymore. It was everything. Emotional, psychological, a constant pull that neither of them could ignore. Her heart pounded, and she looked up at him, seeing the man who held so much power, so much control. She was in his world now, and somehow she wasn't sure if she wanted to leave. "What do you want from me, Ernesto?" she whispered, knowing full well that whatever answer he gave would change everything. His eyes darkened further, his smile almost predatory. "Everything." Nia stood at the edge of the grand staircase, her fingers lightly grazing the banister as she gazed down at the darkened mansion. The silence of the house felt oppressive, thick with the weight of everything that had happened. She had tried to tell herself that she could leave it all behind, walk away from the pull that Ernesto had over her, the way his presence seemed to seep into every part of her life. But now, with each passing moment, she knew it was impossible. She couldn't go back to how things were before. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into this house weeks ago, wide-eyed and eager to keep her head down. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who was tangled up in a web of desire, fear, and something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Ernesto had always been a shadow in her life, but now he was everything. The truth of what he was, the Mafia ties, the danger, the violence that lurked behind the carefully cultivated facade, had shaken her to her core. But it wasn't just the danger that kept her tied to him. It was the way he made her feel, the way he could read her every emotion with a single look, the way he could make her heart race without ever touching her. And yet, as much as she had wanted to deny it, as much as she had tried to push it down, she was still drawn to him. Even now, when she knew how deeply she was entangled in his world, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. The pull between them was magnetic, something primal, something neither of them could escape. The sound of footsteps broke the quiet, and Nia turned to see Ernesto walking toward her, his gait slow, purposeful. His eyes locked onto hers, dark and unreadable. But there was something in them now, something that made her heart race even faster than it already was. "You're still here," he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful, like he was surprised to find her standing there. "I didn't know where else to go," Nia replied, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile tension that hung between them. Ernesto's lips curled into a half smile, the same smile that had haunted her thoughts for days. He didn't need to say anything more. His presence spoke louder than words ever could. He stepped closer, and this time, Nia didn't move away. She couldn't. "You could leave," he said, his voice tinged with something almost like amusement. "You could walk out of this house right now, forget everything we've done, and pretend nothing happened. But we both know you won't." She didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she just stood there, letting the silence stretch between them. She knew he was right. She had tried to leave, tried to distance herself from him, but the truth was she couldn't escape the pull. No matter how hard she tried, she was already too deep. "I can't undo what's happened," Nia said, her voice shaking with the weight of the truth. "And neither can you." Ernesto's smile faded, but the intensity in his eyes only deepened. "No," he agreed quietly. "We can't." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the words hanging in the air, heavy and unspoken. The reality of it all settled over Nia like a storm cloud, dark and inevitable. Things had changed. They could never go back to the way they were, and though she couldn't see the future, she knew it was no longer her own to control. With a final look, Ernesto stepped back, his gaze never leaving hers. He didn't need to say goodbye. Neither of them did. They both knew it wasn't over. It could never be over. And as Nia watched him walk away, she realized that for better or worse, she was already lost to him. The future was uncertain, but there was one truth she couldn't deny. She was tangled in his world, and there was no escaping now.